Okay, strap yourself in for a twisty history lesson. But in typical GM Jim style, we're going to be brief, educational, and try to have some fun along the way. I've always heard comparisons of D&D and Lord of the Rings because, like, dragons and elves or whatever. It's the kind of comparison people unfamiliar with either property make. But in this video, we're going to dig into Gary Gygax's complex and conflicted thoughts on this matter via examinations of a few different articles, including stuff written by Gary himself. You might think you know the whole story, but there are some surprises here. I'm obviously saving the most revealing and juicy stuff until the end. And while it may seem like I'm being critical of Gary, it all comes back around. Just keep watching, you'll see. And check the description below for links to my sources on this topic. Let's get in our Wayback Machine to arrive at a July 2003 thread on the EN World forums where a user named Cimmerians asked, what were the circumstances on the Hobbit race being removed from the original game? Gary, who was a big forum nerd in the 90s and early 2000s, replied, TSR was served with papers threatening damages to the tune of $500,000 by the Saul Xantus division of Elan Merchandising on behalf of the Tolkien estate. The main objection was to the board game we were publishing, The Battle of Five Armies. The author of that game had given us a letter from his attorney claiming the work was grandfathered because it was published after the copyrights for J.R.R.'s works had lapsed and before any renewals were made. The action also demanded we remove Balrog, Dragon, Dwarf, Elf, Ent, Goblin, Hobbit, Orc, and Warg from the D&D game. Although only Balrog and Warg were unique names, we agreed to Hobbit as well. Kept the rest, of course. The board game was dumped and thus the suit was settled out of court after that. And there are some interesting tidbits of conflicting information here. Gary claims that they didn't have to remove Hobbit, but they did anyway. While Tolkien is often credited with inventing the concept of hobbits as hairy-feeted little people, the actual word does predate him all the way back to the 16th century. That could just be a coincidence, though. According to an article on Screen Rant, the lawsuit did force them to change Ent, Balrog, and Hobbit. No mention of Warg there, despite what Gygax said in his forum post. To be fair, it had been 25 years, so maybe his memory on the topic was fuzzy. Here's what happened. Gamer Larry Smith had made the Battle of the Five Armies board game in '75, and then in 1976, TSR snatched up the rights and published it. In 1977, disco-loving IP lawyers from a firm who had licensed the rights to Tolkien's work sent a cease and desist to TSR, which was D&D's publisher at the time. Soon after, the board game was yanked, and new printings of the D&D rules changed a few names to comply. That's the simplest version of the facts. But the meat of what I want to talk about here lies in an article from Dragon Magazine number 95, written by Gary Gygax himself, titled The Influence of J.R.R. Tolkien on the D&D and AD&D Games, Why Middle-earth is Not Part of the Game World. Written in 1985 while probably wearing tube socks and listening to Phil Collins' 8-tracks, it provides some interesting context clues to the events here. Ready yourself, this is about to get interesting. Before we dive in, could I get you to drop a like and subscribe below? I would really appreciate it. Just do it. Just go ahead and do it. Yeah, just do it right now. Anyway, the article begins, a frequently asked question, or assertion in the case of those who don't bother to ask, already starting off a little salty here, Gary, deals with the amount of influence of J.R.R. Tolkien on the creation of the D&D games. In the answer, the popularity of Professor Tolkien's fantasy works did encourage me to develop my own. But while there are bits and pieces of his works reflected hazily in mine, I believe that his influence as a whole is quite minimal. Note the words popularity and encourage there, because those two concepts will come up again. Let's dig in more. Gary goes on to list a series of influences in fiction that he gravitated to as a child and young man. Brothers Grimm, Robert E. Howard, Edgar Allan Poe, etc. Then he describes his love of wargaming and various influences there. And then by the 5th paragraph, Gary goes straight into shots fired mode by saying, though I thoroughly enjoyed The Hobbit, I found the Ring trilogy, well, tedious. The action dragged, and it smacked of an allegory of the struggle of the little common working folk of England against the threat of Hitler's Nazi evil. If I could editorialize here for a second, I gotta say, I agree with Gary. I love the Peter Jackson movies, or the first three anyway, but I've never read the Lord of the Rings trilogy in its entirety. I've tried many times and just get bored with all the excessive lore and songs and blah blah blah. Gygax goes on for quite a while detailing all the problems with the books, like saying Sauron is poorly developed and there's not enough Tom Bombadil. And then there's even more shots fired on the next page. Gygax says, "The name Ent is interesting. Tolkien took the name from an Anglo-Saxon word for giant, which is a subtly passive-aggressive way of saying, see, you didn't actually invent it, you stole it from another word." Gary's saltiness is coming through loud and clear. Grab the popcorn, we're getting dramatic. He does go on to give a lot of credit to Tolkien for the hobbits inspiring halflings, but refutes any notion that the D&D dwarves or elves were Tolkien-based. But then, this article takes a turn. Gary gives us the most clear-cut explanation for why any of this happened. The seeming parallels and inspirations are actually the results of a studied effort to capitalize on the then-current craze for Tolkien's literature. Frankly, to attract those readers, and often at the urgings of persons who were playing prototypical forms of D&D games, I used certain names and attributes in a superficial manner merely to get their attention. And this is the record scratch statement. After spending a couple thousand words arguing that Tolkien didn't influence him much because Lord of the Rings wasn't actually that great, and Gygax had a bajillion other stronger influences, here he lets his motives slip. He's saying, well, yeah, obviously I stole it because people love this crap. It's all about getting those clicks, baby. And then he finishes by writing, as anyone familiar with both D&D games and Tolkien works can affirm, there is no resemblance between the two, and it is well nigh impossible to recreate any Tolkien-based fantasy while remaining within the boundaries of the game system. Here, his final argument is, it doesn't matter that we stole Ents, hobbits, balrogs, etc., because the game becomes its own thing as soon as you start to play. As a player and game designer of Dungeons & Dragons, I completely get what he means by this. The spirit of tabletop role-playing games is all about taking inspiration and then spinning it into your own story that becomes something unique to you and your friends at the table. Obviously, though, that argument would not hold up in court, which is why TSR was forced to change the language. And what is the moral of the story here? I'm not sure if there is one, or maybe it's this. The nice thing about playing TTRPGs in the comfort of your own home or on the internet with just your friends is that you can do whatever you want with your stories. You can set a game in the world of Middle-earth, or Hyrule, or Narnia, or Westeros, or wherever you want. No one can stop you. Where it gets legally tricky is when you decide to make a product to sell to other people. So if you're going to try to do that, do your due diligence first and make sure you won't get sued, because being sued sucks. If Gary Gygax were still around, I'm sure he would agree with me. Thanks to Screen Rant, EN World via the Web Archive, the Museum of Play blog, and Dragon Magazine for providing the background research on this video. Until next time, this is GM Jim. Now go out there and play in your world.